So it's so nice to be here. Thank you, and it's nice to meet this new community. It's actually exciting to hear all this discussion of cryptographic protocols. It brings me back to my youth in some ways, and I'll try to explain. I started out in abstract mathematics and topology, and was interested in certain social problems, and ended up as a government consultant in the early 1980s, which, as you can see, neither I nor any of my colleagues did a very good job with the world, because today we have exactly the same problem we were hoping to solve in the mid-1980s and did not. And it seems to me more dangerous than ever. So I did fall in with the government, and cryptography was easy to learn, and I enjoyed it. But I never really liked it as mathematics because it seemed too human. It's like keeping a secret from someone else or something like that. And I wanted mathematics to be universal and abstract. But then as I learned a little more, particularly about physics and biology, I had a change of heart, and I decided cryptography was actually natural and beautiful and did not actually necessarily have to do with keeping secrets from the Soviet Union, which is now Russia, of course. So when I said biology, we ourselves, our bodies, are error-correcting codes. And you may remember Fukushima about a dozen years ago. At the time, I was curious, and I did a little back-of-the-envelope calculation on what fraction of our chemical bonds are broken with a fatal dose of radiation. Turns out the lethal dose for 50% of the population for full body exposure is approximately 5 sieverts, which is a CIS unit. It's a joule per kilogram body weight. And if you just look up the energy of chemical bonds, ionic and covalent bonds, and you think about the efficiency of the radiation breaking these, give it an overall efficiency of 10 or 20%. What you find is that a fatal dose of radiation breaks somewhere between 1 in a million and 1 in 100,000 of your bonds. So basically, we can correct a 1 in a million mistake. If 1 out of every million of our bonds is ripped apart, our repair mechanisms will put it back together. We may get cancer 5 years on, but we'll survive. Whereas if 1 in 100,000 are broken, we just fall apart in literally a pool of sludge. By the way, they're much better codes, and we could be much better at radiation, but there was no evolutionary necessity. We do fall apart after 100 years max, but we don't seem to need to live longer than that. It seems to be that you can have a perfectly good life in 100 years. I know some people disagree. Now, I actually, in the last 25 years, 20 years, have been working mostly in condensed matter physics because I've been involved with quantum computation. And one of the beautiful things that I became aware of is that there are much more interesting substances in the world than what we're made out of. The Bible puts it well. It says we're dust. A little more technically, we're organic dust, a lot of carbon in there. But microscopically, we're quite mundane. And the most interesting states of matter are actually very delicate and will be disrupted thermally. So they only can be created and only survive at millikelvin temperatures. So these are temperatures that are very close to absolute zero. Absolute zero is something like 273 degrees below 0 centigrade. And the kinds of refrigeration devices, they're called dilution refrigerators. They work with a mixture of helium-3 and helium-4. And there's actually a beautiful physical fact that helium-3 has higher vapor pressure inside helium-4 than in the vacuum, and this is what's exploited. If if it wasn't for this miracle, we probably would know very little about these phases of matter. I didn't put it on the slide, but the quantum Hall effect is maybe the chief source of these states of matter. What you should think of as a crystal interface between two slightly different alloys of semiconductor, maybe indium arsenide and gallium indium arsenide. And in this crystal interface can be loaded with electrons by an external potential and placed in a magnetic field. And then the electrons in this little two-dimensional world try to organize themselves in the least energy way with respect to this magnetic field. And they do this elaborate dance. And they find a ground state, but the ground state can have defects in it. And it turns out that these defects are protected by cryptographic principles. So what I wrote on this slide, and I just can try to explain it a little bit, is the ground state is actually high dimensional. There are many different directions in this ground state. But it's impossible for a local operator, like a photon landing or something disturbing the system locally, to move you from one ground state to the other. So that you should think, if you think of cryptography, is, like a big lattice, like the Leech lattice or something, can be used as the code words. And the idea is if you take just one local step, you'll fall off the Leech lattice and you'll be at some neighboring point. But it's correctable. The errors are correctable because the code words are far apart. And if you have an error that takes you off, there's only one sensible place to take you back to. So similarly, the ground states of these very cold special systems have this cryptographic property that they are protected. So they're not protecting themselves from the intrusion of a hostile government. They're protecting themselves from the intrusion of thermal noise, thermal energy. But the same principles of redundancy and uniqueness and unique recovery that make cryptography work against intelligent adversaries also make cryptography effective in protecting the most delicate physical systems. And these physical systems are inherently quantum computers. The basic operations of excitations within these systems do what computer scientists call gates in a quantum computer. So I've thought, since I got into this subject, that if we're going to really build a robust quantum computing technology, we have to first develop our ability to manipulate these topological phases because they like being quantum computers. We should let them do what they want to do. So in the last 2-3 minutes, I have a little slideshow, which is just trying to help you visualize how these excitations, I got bored and I called them all the same Greek letter, sigma, because that's the name of one of these excitations in the Ising CFT. But it was known for many years that if you could braid these excitations around, it would change the particular ground state you were in within this manifold according to these gates. But the little slideshow I want to show you is about how measurement can simulate braiding, which is probably a more practical technological approach to building quantum computers in these cryptographically protected systems. So it's a little slideshow, and we imagine that we have two particles we want to braid, and we introduce another pair of particles we call ancillas, and we measure them. The little ovals is a hypothetical measurement. We measure the collective state of those two particles. You can think of it if you fused them together, whether they would disappear into the vacuum or spout out a third particle. And the little icon on the lower right is showing you the world history of that measurement. It's as if the two particles, the ancillas, fused and came apart, but fused into the vacuum. And now if we do another measurement, you see, to see the icon on the left there, you have to tilt those four particles so you're looking at them edgewise. So you should see the two particles are being measured, the first one and third one, behind the second one, if that makes sense. If you tip this figure that way, and you see these two particles represent these two world lines, and they're being measured behind the world line of that particle. So you have to put in like a little bit of three-dimensional perspective. And then if you make a third measurement, and a fourth measurement, what you see is that the world history of these measurements has created a braid between the original two particles and returned the ancilla to its original condition. So this is supposed to show you that the ability to measure excitations in pairs is actually an equivalent primitive in this computer language, if you like, to braiding, and probably a more practical one technologically. So if you imagined a whole sea of millions of these particles, a computer would work by having little arms reach out in a way to create interferometers and do these measurements in the appropriate sequence, measurement simulating braiding. And if you want to know what these little fingers and arms reaching out really would be in this sort of semiconductor world, well, here's just a slightly less stylized picture of a semiconductor heterostructure with metallic gates, those are gray, placed on top. And then the way you measure the collective charge, say within the inner circle there, which might contain two excitations, is by running a red edge current around, a tunneling current. And tunneling currents, they have two ways they can cross. They can cross at T1 or they can cross at T2, and this produces, as always in quantum mechanics, an interference effect. You probably studied the double slit experiment, which is a particular interference effect of either electrons or photons going through two slits. The T1 and T2 are the analogs of slits, and devices of this kind have been built as interferometers to measure the topological charge on excitations. So that was very rapid. I gave you sort of the last lecture in the entire semester course. But that's the one you wait for. That's the one that's fun. So maybe the takeaway point is that cryptography is more than a human invention or human interactions. It actually protects the most interesting bits of nature.
Thanks. We're now all getting our degrees.
So I roughly took that semester course at one point, but it was before, or I had not heard that measurement could be used for grading. I find that really compelling, and I apologize that my question is going to be kind of disjoint from what you covered, but related a little bit, but hopefully very interesting to this audience. I rarely get to talk to someone with a background in math who has also touched on cryptography and topological quantum computing. Do you have like a rough estimate, probability-wise, that you think BQP includes NP complete?
Oh,
and,
I think
like to the lay audience,
zero.
Like, what's the probability that like cryptography itself? Like,
Zero.
Zero. Okay.
So actually, I defer to my friend Scott Aronson on this question. So I was at a talk he gave at KITP, in which someone in the audience sort of groaned and said, well, what if P equals NP? And Scott got kind of excited on it. What I say to people who ask, what if P equals NP? What I say to them is, what if President Kennedy was killed by space aliens in order to prevent him from publishing a proof of that fact? So what Scott said about your specific question is P is grapefruit juice, NP is rocket fuel, and BQP is wine. It's much closer to grape juice.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you, Mike.